The Russian Empire. By the turn of the 19th century, its land had composed the grassy plains of Poland to the frozen taiga of Siberia, reaching all the way from White to Pacific seas. A vast empire of 125 million strong with seemingly unlimited resources. Yet, despite all of its power and prestige, it would collapse during the February Revolution and would fall into civil war after the October Revolution. This video will serve as context for the situation of the Russian Empire prior to Tsar Nicholas II's ascension as emperor. On January 24, 1878, future Menshevik leader Vera Zashevich shot and non-fatally wounded Colonel Trepov, the governor of St. Petersburg. During the subsequent trial, despite clear evidence of her guilt, she was found non-guilty by the public prosecutor in a public court case which was only made available by Tsar Alexander II's earlier judicial reforms. However, this was but one of many assassinations to come, as another major terrorist attack on August 4th took the life of the chief of the Gendarmes. The Gendarmes being the state security services, often acting as state police forces. Shortly after, the panic government implemented the so-called temporary rulings, in where assaults on government officials would be tried in military courts. By this point, the imperial government, for all intents and purposes, viewed itself in enemy territory, and increasingly relied on military measures to keep order, where they would remain in effect until the 1905 revolution. The temporary rulings were just the start to the imperial government's descent into a police state, as further measures were imposed, such as allowing the chief of the Gendarmes to exile the citizenry without trial on the mere suspicion of treacherous actions. Even these countermeasures proved inadequate to stop the terror, as in early 1880 a terrorist infiltrated the Winter Palace disguised as a carpenter and blew up the dining room. Luckily for the Tsar and his entourage, they had arrived late and thus escaped the explosion. In response to the ever-increasing terrorist attacks, often committed by the organization known as the People's Will, a central political police was established under the watch of the Ministry of the Interior, which reformed the original and underfunded so-called Third Section. Being given large amounts of power, it was in charge with the prevention of crimes against the state, guarding the state frontier, issuing internal passports, and even supervising taverns and firefighting. Its power was so great that it even required permission from the police to hold public assemblies. Despite the terror, Tsar Alexander II continued to push for reforms, such as Dolores and Mokolov Constitution. However, for the most part, these proved impossible. As the bodies from the assassinations continued to mount, the Tsar proved unable to pass any major reforms. Now, on March 13, 1881, on the snowy fields outside the Winter Palace, the Tsar himself would be mortally wounded by a terrorist of the People's Will movement. Shortly after, he would die in the Winter Palace, surrounded by members of the Romanov family. With the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, his reactionary son, Tsar Alexander III, took the throne and rapidly began dismantling any of the previous political reform. Embracing the system of patrimony, in which the entire country was considered the Tsar's personal fiefdom and where his will was absolute, Tsar Alexander began attempting to rapidly centralize power around the person of the Tsar. This was seen in the so-called reinforced safeguard, which allowed governors to arrest and imprison citizens for a time ranging from 1 to 3 months, and the extraordinary safeguard, which also allowed imprisonment as well as the closing of public institutions, combined with massive fines up to 3,000 rubles. The only thing these safeguards showed the public was how the government perceived itself. It perceived itself as under siege, with the citizenry being its enemies, as even great cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg were placed under reinforced safeguard. Life would become a bureaucratic nightmare, with police becoming omnipresent. Everything from opening schools to newspapers to enrolling in universities became under police watch, and Russia would be an autocracy only in name, as the thin veil of the monarchy couldn't hide the police state behind. All these countermeasures proved contrary to the actual problem, as for the most part, the terrorism was only limited to small terrorist organizations such as the People's Will, with the majority of the citizenry not being involved in it. However, with these safeguards, and with the ever-increasing police presence, the citizenry became ever more politicized against the monarchy. Despite the increasing power of the police state, the government was never able to properly expand to the countryside, as since the very founding of a Russian state, the great peasant fields of Russia were almost uncharted territory, with some officials even proclaiming, "We know about as much as the Tulen countryside as we do of Africa." Peasant agriculture had long been relegated to simply feeding the peasants instead of exporting until Russia's increasing globalized commerce began, leaving the central government in St. Petersburg little interest to micromanage the affairs of the countryside. Local landowners and nobles were entrusted with the task of collecting taxes and conscripts when ordered, but for the most part, even the landowners who oversaw the peasants had great autonomy, and the peasants themselves having even greater autonomy from the landlords. Even into the late 1800s and early 1900s, this remained true. Despite the fact that the Russian economy was deeply entrenched in agriculture, even this was sorely behind, with the average crop yield being barely half that of Europe. With such ineffective farming practices, it was very hard to make a profit. This would come into play after emancipation, when peasants were no longer bound by the rule of their masters and would actually have to be paid for their services. As the landlords and nobles had no experience in actually making a profit off their land, they were completely incapable of dealing with the new realities of the situation, causing many of them to flee the countryside for a city life. However, the imperial government attempted to rectify this by establishing a local council known as the Zemstvo. However, even the Zemstvo would be targeted by Alexander III's counter-reforms. While not directly abolishing it, he would attempt to destroy their power base by implementing the system known as the land captains. The land captains would have near dictatorial power over the peasants, quite possibly even unprecedented from what they had during serfdom, which to the peasants this was a painful reminder of. They would have the power to override peasant councils and even to flog peasants for even minor offenses such as not greeting the land captain properly. The Industrial Revolution had reached Russia very late compared to their European counterparts, and it was only under the Minister of Finance, Sergei, with that Russian industrialization began to rapidly take off. Previously, up until it, most manufactured goods were made in so-called peasant cottage industry, which was small-scale artisan industry done by the peasants in time between farming. Witt's policy consisted of securing foreign loans from across Europe to invest in Witt's policies would prove to be highly successful as Russian industry began to rapidly take off. Between 1890 and 1900, industrial production exploded by 200 to 400%, while total industrial value more than doubled from 1.5 billion rubles to 3.4 billion. And by the time at the start of the First World War, it had reached the unprecedented 5.7 billion, nearly 5 times what it was originally. However, despite the great success, this would still have consequences to the Russian Empire, as with so much debt in foreign hands, the government became increasingly reliant on the will of foreign powers, and as crises such as the 1905 revolution would occur, their foreign debt would massively decrease in value, thus damaging their economy. And even despite the rapid industrialization, most of the economy remained agrarian, and even the industrial working class would be largely made out of part-time peasants, with only very few being actual full-time workers living in the city. There would also be reactionary backlash against industrialization, especially in the imperial court, who especially feared the fact that foreign debt was in foreign hands. Despite all these negatives, industrialization would continue with great success, and would put Russia on the course to becoming a great industrial power in times. Despite the rapidly growing economy, disaster would strike as in 1891 a massive famine would begin. Starting in the Volga region, the famine would spread across the entire empire, causing a massive catastrophe. The crisis would expand to 17 provinces holding over 36 million people. Soon, cholera and typhoid epidemics would begin as the fleeing peasants spread the disease more and more. Aid was not able to be properly given out, with the ineffective transport system of the empire, as due to the vast stretches of the Russian Empire, where even despite its rapid industrialization, it would take a very long time for railroads to properly connect the entire empire. In order to prevent mass flight from the countryside, the imperial government would employ police Cossacks to enforce peasants to remain at their farms, even as food ran out and disease spread around them. It was only on November 19th that the government fully realized how far the situation had fallen out of their control. Soon they desperately began calling on local organizations, i.e., organizations outside of the government's control, to begin assisting in the famine, as well as foreign aid, such as the aid given by the United States. This had an unprecedented turn in Russian history, as never before had the imperial government so openly allowed non-government organizations to act in such a way. By the end of the disaster, an estimated 300 to 500,000 would die. This would also be a rebirth of anti-Tsarist sentiments, as much of the populace blamed the imperial government for its poor handling of the situation, while non-government organizations, such as the Zemstvo, would massively gain in popularity thanks to their handling of the situation. Soon every government organization would come under fire, even the Orthodox Church, with even prominent authors such as Leo Tolstoy partially blaming the church for the disaster. But attacks against the church were nothing new in Russia. For a long time, the Orthodox Church had been losing support from the populace. Even hundreds of years ago, the Russian clergy had become wholly entrenched in so-called worldly affairs, as many of the clergy had become landowners, not too similar from nobility, with the main exception is that they avoided paying tax. In 1480, following the example of Greek monks, Nil Sorsitsky removed himself from the world. Soon other Russian monks would follow his example. Not long after, Nil would become involved in debate involving monastic holdings. This would be the start to a great schism in this church, as even more anti-property clerics would join, such as Maxim the Greek, forming what would be known as the Judaizers. They found their main opponent in a man from the Volomousk monastery named Joseph. Using a combination of theological arguments and court intrigue, Joseph would fight against the reformer. Joseph would move towards portraying himself as the defender of the autocracy to gain support from the imperial court, going as far as to place his abbey under personal protection of the Tsar, which at the time was quite unprecedented. Many other monasteries would follow in his example. This would be the beginning of the church becoming wholly reliant on the Tsar, and thus becoming the staunch defender of the autocracy. The schism would fully divide the church during the reforms of the Patriarch Nikon in the 1660s. Originally, he had the support of the pious Tsar Alexei. Using this support, he began to restore the church-state balance and started completely reforming the church to better represent true Greek orthodoxy and restoring spirituality. Unfortunately for Nikon, he alienated much of the court, and who began turning the Tsar against him. Thus, he would leave his post as patriarch, hoping that Alexis would ask for forgiveness. However, he did not, and after a failed debate to win over the Holy Synod, the governing body of the Orthodox Church in Russia, the church reverted back to its pre-Nikon ways. However, despite the Synod's decree, much of the laity defected from the main church and split the official church, beginning what would be called the Old Believer heresy. The church would become reliant on the government to enforce its membership, even making leaving orthodoxy illegal, as many people wished to leave the mainstream Orthodox Church and join the Old Believers. From this point on, the church would become fully reliant on the autocracy, and thus it would have to enforce anything the autocracy demanded. This would later make them into police informers, enforcers of imperial decrees, and all other sorts that completely broke from the spiritual nature of orthodoxy. It is believed that in the later stage of the Russian Empire, despite what the official statistics were, that Old Believers could have encompassed 1/3 of the Orthodox population or even higher. Despite the numerous crises, there was still hope for a change when on November 1st, 1894, Tsar Alexander III died. Some prominent liberals would hope that the new Tsar, Tsar Nicholas II, would be a force for progressive change in Russia. However, this would be proven to be quite incorrect. Thank you for watching. The next episode will be going over the reign of Tsar Nicholas II.